In the second hour of today's Leonard Lopate Show, Marc Gerstein explains why accidents like Chernobyl and the Challenger explosion aren't so accidental after all.
You're listening to the Leonard Lopate Show on AM 820 and 93.9 WNYC.
I'm Jeffrey Toobin, pinch hitting today for Leonard Lopate. This is WNYC and WNYC.org. Have you ever wondered how far you'd go to prevent something really terrible from happening? According to Marc Gerstein, possibly not as far as you'd imagine. He's concluded in his new book, Flirting with Disaster, that most people don't speak up, even when they suspect a serious threat. And people who do speak up are often ignored by those in authority, who are reluctant to challenge the status quo. His new book, which he wrote with Michael Ellsberg, is published by Union Square Press, and I am pleased to welcome Marc Gerstein to the Leonard Lopate Show today. Hi, Marc.
How are you, Jeffrey?
I'm very well, sir. Okay, what I found most interesting about your book is the description of an event that I think is endlessly fascinating, which is the Challenger disaster. Why the Challenger was launched in 1986 in cold weather. And I wonder if you could just start by describing, it's a little bit of a complicated story, but just summarize, if you could, the dramatic story of the warnings heard and not heard in the period leading up to that launch in January of 1986.
Well, as everybody remembers, probably, Challenger exploded, and they probably also remember that it had something to do with O-rings, whatever those might have been as far as people's memories are concerned. What they actually are is sort of quarter-inch rubber gaskets that go around the outside of the sections of the rocket boosters that push up the shuttle during launch. And those O-rings had a long history of problems. They were never actually designed properly in the first place, and the engineers that work for Morton Thiokol, the company that made the rocket boosters, were very worried about the way they behaved because they were subject to erosion and being burned by the propellant gases that were streaming out of the rocket and so forth. And they wanted to get these things fixed. But unfortunately, at that point in time, the shuttle had been designated a sort of operational system that nobody wanted to go back to the drawing board about. So the engineers had arguments back and forth with their own management and with NASA about whether or not they should really take dramatic steps to redesign the whole way that the boosters were put together in order to be safer than the engineers thought they were.
And they did not do a dramatic redesign.
They had a plan for one, but it was going to take a long time and so forth, so they decided to run the shuttle as is. And there were some people that were very worried about that, but they did it anyway.
Now, one of the things you write in the book, which I had been unaware of, is about a NASA policy about quantifying risk. Is that a fair? I'm trying to summarize it, but they had a policy that they wanted to consider risk in what they considered a logical way.
Well, I think all the people who deal with complicated systems that have some potential to go badly wrong have to figure out what the risks are. I mean, if you think about what insurance companies do who are trying to insure you against your car getting bashed up or your house flooding or a hurricane decimating your beachfront property, they have to do an analytical job as well. And NASA, who had built one of the most complicated machines ever created, had to figure out what the likelihood was that something was going to go wrong. But what the most important thing about NASA was in the Apollo program that preceded the shuttle, they assumed that if they couldn't understand something, that it must be risky and therefore they shouldn't fly. By the time they got to the operational system called the Space Shuttle, they had changed their policy and decided that if they couldn't prove it was risky, then it was safe to fly. And that difference in their attitude, if they couldn't reach a definitive proof, is probably at the end of the day what destroyed the shuttle.
So the presumption changed from a presumption of, well, if we don't know, something bad is out there, to a presumption that, well, if we don't know, then everything will probably work out okay.
And let me fast forward for you. Imagine that somebody like Alan Greenspan or somebody else says, we're not so sure that these CDOs and other subprime products are as safe and secure as we thought they were. Maybe we ought to go a little slower. Now, what do? Do you assume when you don't know, because nobody really knew, whether or not you should slow things down or whether you shouldn't slow things down? And so whether it's the space shuttle, whether it's a new product, a new drug, the question always is, what do you do if you're not sure?
We're talking with Marc Gerstein, the author of the new book, Flirting with Disaster, about how mistakes happen and how we can be presentable. We can try to present them more. Is going with your gut about the prospect of mistakes, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's a very central point to the book. There are a lot of things that people's intuition is pretty reliable about, and that is in areas where the risks occur more or less all the time. And also, it's not a bad thing to do if the consequences, if you're wrong, are not that serious. On the other hand, if things occur only rarely, so you don't have that much evidence about it, or the consequences are so catastrophic that you can't afford to take the risk, then maybe your intuition is not the best guide.
Well, one criticism one might offer for your book is that, in looking back at these stories, it's easy to second guess after the fact. And, one of my favorite Oliver Wendell Holmes quotes is, the timid may stay at home. In other words, if you don't take any risks, if you just stay home all day, nothing's going to happen. So how do you avoid just retrospective second guessing and intelligent second guessing?
Well, I think that the cases in the book are not about second guessing. They're about situations where there were consistent patterns of evidence that emerged from lots of different sources that things were worrisome. The Challenger, as an example, since we started with that, had a long history of O-ring problems, engineers saying that they shouldn't launch for that reason. And on that day and on that morning, not only were the engineers at Morton Thiokol saying don't launch, but the engineers from Rockwell who were worried about the ice on the gantry saying don't launch.
I didn't realize until I read that in your book how flat and definitive the Rockwell engineers were, saying don't launch this spacecraft, and they overruled that. That was really shocking to me.
Well, the mystery that has plagued this particular story for all these years was, why did NASA launch over the objections of these two contractors who weren't in the habit of saying don't launch? Why did they launch on that day and that time when there was a long history of delaying the shuttle flights without much consequence?
Well, you suggest there is a possible political explanation for that because the State of the Union address by President Reagan was scheduled to be given that night, and there was a sense on the part of some people that Reagan really wanted to talk about Kristen McAuliffe, the first teacher in space. And so do you think that there was a political dimension to the story?
Well, the problem is nobody really knows. Reagan denied that he had anything to do with it, and the White House denied it, but there was a pattern of telephone calls. There seemed to be a lack of thorough getting to the bottom of the investigation. Some people were never interviewed. We really don't know. But I think the issue that anybody has to ask is, when there are important, powerful leaders that want a particular outcome, what's likely to happen to the people in the middle of the organization when they know that to be true? Are they likely to be cautious, or are they likely to do the things that are going to result in the leader getting what he wants, even if it involves taking more risk than maybe people should take?
Now, another subject you write about at length in your book, Flirting with Disaster, is Hurricane Katrina, which you call arguably the best predicted accident in American history. The New Orleans Times-Picayune had been writing about the weakness in the levees. I think there had been television specials on the prospects for floods in New Orleans. Why didn't New Orleans do a better job preparing?
Well, that's a very complicated story. Part of it is political, part of it is financial, part of it is the nature of the very unusual politics that Louisiana happens to manifest. Some people have called it a very corrupt place.
No, really? Louisiana? Hard to imagine. I've never heard that. I always thought it was kind of like Seattle, good government kind of place. But anyway, I guess that is true that some people have said Louisiana is somewhat corrupt. But I mean, I guess when I read when I read your book, and of course, all of us have read about the issue of why they didn't prepare the levees better, why it was so shoddy there. Is it anything more complicated than this would have been really, really expensive, and it was a problem that was not immediately visible, and they put it off?
Well, that's the sort of simplified version of the story. But one of the
is it wrong though?
One of the things I did in the book was did a financial analysis. I said, if this was a return on investment decision, would it be a good decision to make? And it turned out that it was such a foolish decision on purely financial ground. Pay the money now versus clean it up if it goes wrong. And even on that basis, it didn't make any sense.
You also do an interesting analysis of the way public officials talked about the chances of a disaster. And it's interesting, most of us who were not statistics majors in college have trouble understanding when people start talking about a 1,000-year flood or a once in 30 years. There's a lot of game playing that goes on with probabilities, isn't there?
Well, people throw the numbers around so that they can create the impression that they didn't make a policy mistake, because who could have imagined that a 1 in 200-year flood or a 1 in 300-year flood could possibly happen in our lifetime? And those kinds of numbers, while they're accurate, don't actually tell you what you want to know, which is how long over let's say, the next 10 years, what's the likelihood that there's going to be a big one that's going to catch us by surprise? And those numbers, because of the way the statistics work, are not the same. And so
in fact, you say that even based on the numbers that were available to the government before Katrina, the chances of a disastrous flood were about 1 in 6, like playing Russian roulette.
Exactly. And for people who think that maybe this was just a 1 in a million shot, which of course it wasn't, Hurricane Rita came right after Katrina. So we had 2 in a row. Now, that one didn't hit New Orleans, but the point is that having 2 severe storms, one right after the other, is not that unusual after all.
Well, another subject you write about a great deal in your book is the subject of whistleblowers, and there is a family connection there. Your co-author is Michael Ellsberg, whose father was Daniel Ellsberg, one of the most famous whistleblowers in American history, who leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. How should our society deal with whistleblowers differently than we do now?
Well, if somebody does an irrational thing, like going into a dangerous area with a gun by their side in order to save their comrades in a combat situation, and does something completely nuts like that, when they come home, we pin a medal on them, and we celebrate them for the rest of their lives. If somebody in a large organization does the same thing, they put their life and career at risk by blowing the whistle on the organization but save millions of lives in the process, we destroy their lives completely and make sure that they never work again.
And that ain't good. So anyway, I have to stop now. I really appreciate it. This is Jeffrey Toobin, and today for Leonard Lopate, I've been speaking today with Marc Gerstein, author of Flirting with Disaster, just published by Union Square Press. Marc, thank you for joining us.
It's been a great pleasure.